Good morning, everyone. I'm Jake Ruzevick, for those of you I haven't met. I'm one of the fourth-year residents here, but it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce my dad, Jim Ruzevick, to Grand Rounds this morning and to my University of Washington family. He was born in Chicago and later graduated from Southern Illinois University. He later joined the United States Navy, where he was an S-3 pilot or a submarine hunter. He's now a Delta captain based out of Seattle, and he flies primarily the 757 and has almost certainly flown Dr. Zhang over to China a few times.
In fact, that's probably why he hasn't got
That's right. To date, he's flown over 20,000 hours from the time he was in the Navy up until now. And I think ultimately our professions are very different, from taking care of neurosurgical patients to flying people halfway around the globe. But I think the goal of doing so is, we try to do it very safely. And I think hopefully we can all learn a little something today from his practices and how we can better take care of our neurosurgical patients. Right, so Captain Ruzevick.
Very good.
I think having my son introduce me at Grand Rounds is pretty cool. Good morning, everyone, and I'd just like to start off by saying I'm a little bit out of my element here. I've never before given a talk to a large group of medical professionals, and I've never given a talk to a small group of medical professionals. I'm usually stuck inside my little box talking to the co-pilot and air traffic controllers, but I'll go ahead and give it my best effort. I'm invited to talk about aviation safety, and the major goal of in aviation is aircraft and passenger safety. This morning I'm going to review checklist, talk about our flight operations quality assurance program, checklist, crew resource management, fatigue, and then I'll hit on some emerging issues. In aviation, it's often said we've gone from the extraordinary to the ordinary. From the Wright brothers flying 120 feet in 1903 at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, to the NASA Space Shuttle, we've seen explosive growth in the complexity of aviation. Nowadays, it's commonplace to passengers to fly coast to coast or even intercontinental. Our challenge is to do so routinely, but more importantly, safely. Despite the increased complexity, our accident rate has decreased dramatically from when the time when planes were less advanced. It's commonly said that there is a lower probability of dying in an airplane crash than crossing the street. Mile for mile, automobiles are about 100 times more deadly than flying. Sometimes I'm asked what's the most dangerous part of my job, and my standard answer is driving to or from the airport. Just a little bit about my background. Jake touched on it. I grew up in the Chicago area, and I kind of caught the aviation bug kind of early in my life. I was about 10 years old. And on a Sunday, my dad, we had a family outing to O'Hare Field. At that time, they had a big observation deck, observation platform, where you could just watch the planes take off and land. And I was just mesmerized by it. I just thought it was so cool. And I remember telling my dad afterwards, "Oh, Dad, I want to be an airline pilot." And I kind of followed up on that dream. So after finishing high school, I started college, and I went to Southern Illinois University. And we had a small aviation program. It was like a combination of a maintenance program and a flight school. So I had acquired my A&P, my aircraft and power plant mechanics license, and did acquired my private pilot's license my freshman year. And then I started on my commercial license, and I kind of quickly ran out of money. And it kind of dawned on me that, this flying gig is kind of expensive. So it just so happened at the end of my freshman year, the Navy recruiter came down to school, and he showed us some films about flying F-14s and flying off aircraft carriers, and I said, "Oh, that's cool. How can I get into this program?" So I applied, was accepted into the AVROC, the Aviation Reserve Officer Candidate Program in the Navy, and I was basically an inactive reservist in the Navy. And then when I graduated from college, I went down to Pensacola for 4 months of military indoctrination, and I came out as a Navy officer. And they used to kind of make fun of us because they used to call us 16-week wonders. I came out, started out as a college kid, and 16 weeks later, we came out as a Navy ensign. I went through Navy pilot training and flew off the aircraft carriers USS Kitty Hawk and USS Carl Vinson. That picture on the left-hand corner, that's the plane I flew in the fleet. It was a Lockheed S-3 Viking. And after I had a 7-year tour of duty in the Navy, after that 7 years was up, I put out my job applications and got hired by Northwest Airlines up in Minneapolis. And there I flew the 727, but never as a captain on the 727, but I was a captain on an Airbus A320 and Airbus A330 out of Minneapolis, Detroit, Seattle. About in 2008, Delta Airlines and Northwest Airlines merged, and at that point I transferred to flying the Boeing 757, 767, and that's my current position that I'm in now. Back in about 2003, we had to keep a logbook of our hours, and at that time I had about 14,000 hours flying commercial airplanes. And then that requirement changed, everything went on the computer, so I have over 20,000 hours flying airplanes. I really can't give you an exact number, but I just started my 34th year, and I still like it. It's fun. I enjoy it. I don't mind going to work at all. It seems like when I hear a speech, there's always a famous quote thrown in, and this would be a famous aviation quote from a smart pilot. But I also wanted to add to it a little bit, and my 2 cents is that safety can be compromised by complacency, distractions, and time constraints. Just a little bit about checklists here. Checklists played a major role in the aviation safety record. They were so pivotal to the success of the Apollo moon landing that astronaut Michael Collins coined the term the fourth crew member. However, prior to the 1930s, checklists were not used in aviation. Just a little bit of a history lesson here. I was not aware of this incident when I started doing the research for this talk, but I found it to be pretty interesting. In the 1930s, the nation was obsessed by the technology of flight. The military is looking at aviation as an edge to protect our coastlines should another war like World War I break out. Halfway through the Great Depression in 1834, the U.S. Army Air Corps called for a competition to evaluate and buy long-range bombers. At that time, there were 3 major aircraft manufacturers, Douglas, Boeing, and Martin Aircraft. Douglas was the biggest threat to Boeing because of the success of their DC-2 passenger plane. Boeing was eager to prove that they had the best technology, and they had the Model 299, which was later known as the V-17, already in development. The competition at Wright Airfield in Dayton, Ohio was considered a mere formality because it was widely believed that Boeing was the clear front-runner due to its advanced technology. It was made of aluminum alloy, had a 103-foot wingspan with 4 engines. It carried 5 times the number of bombs, and it flew faster and with a range twice as far as its competitors. At that time in aviation, cockpit drills weren't memorized. Before start checks consisted of a left-to-right scan around the cockpit, setting up the desired switches and levers, checking various instruments, and testing and setting trim controls. Unfortunately, the demonstration did not go as planned. During takeoff roll, the nose of the plane abruptly pitched upward. The plane climbed sharply to 300 feet, banked and stalled. It fell to the ground in a flat attitude and burst into flames. As you can see by the picture, the tail section, which ultimately contained the cause of the crash, was virtually intact. Investigators discovered that the pilot forgot to release the locking mechanism for the rudder and elevator controls. This was critical because they determined the up and down pitch as well as the left and right yaw of the aircraft. One of the advanced features of this plane was a built-in control locking mechanism that was under the pilot's control. Previously, it was located on the outside of the plane and was released by the ground crew prior to taxi. A newspaper reported the crash and coined the phrase that the V-17 was too much plane for one man's memory to fly. During the debrief, it was acknowledged that the B-17 was a complex plane. The accident was not caused by structural failure or aerodynamic design. The pilots were highly trained and experienced. Boeing was extremely confident in their technology and design, yet the accident was due to pilot failure to unlock the elevator control. Ordinarily, pilots make checks of their flight controls movement, but this did not occur. To avoid another accident, it was determined that the pilots needed some simple checklist. The 5 listed here is what they came up with. Despite losing the contract, the military was so confident in the B-17, they ordered a dozen planes for testing purposes. All pilots were taught how to use checklists. Almost 2 million miles were flown without serious incident, so the Army entered into a contract with Boeing to produce the B-17 for them. During World War II, the Army didn't have time to do a multi-year testing training program for its young pilots. The checklist was a pivotal part of their training. The checklist ended up saving many lives. According to the Army, the checklist was an essential tool for exhausted aviators returning from bombing missions to remember critical items before landing. By the time the war ended, over 12,700 bombers had been ordered. It flew in all theaters of war with over 300,000 sorties flown. And the checklist was cemented as a critical but routine safety tool in aviation. Checklists have evolved from the 1930s. Recall that the Boeing and the Army Air Corps developed 5 checklists for the B-17. As advances have been made in aviation, so has the need for more checklists. As you can see, today's commercial checklists cover every phase of aircraft operation. These checklists are done for every single flight. The concepts used in the design of today's checklist are grounded in the science of human psychology. Aircraft manufacturers, the airline industry, and the FAA all play a role in their development. And each airline tailors their respective checklist. An important objective of checklists is that it's not a to-do list, but a reminder not to overlook critical items with the goal of a consistent configuration of the aircraft. There's a sequential progression to the checklist, allowing us to cross-check each other's respective systems. By keeping each other in the loop, we work as a team. And finally, checklists serve as a quality control tool by management and government regulators. In the cockpit, our checklist procedure is standardized. Each pilot has specific duties related to the plane's configuration. It's not combined with other tasks, and there's a logical sequence or flow. We verify each other's configuration with a specific challenge and response call-out of visual confirmation. And I'll show that example in the next few slides. Critical items are duplicated. For example, we check the flap position during both taxi and prior to takeoff. Just a word about sterile cockpit here. It is my preference to have a sterile cockpit, which means no non-essential communication from the time the flight attendant closes the cockpit door to 10,000 feet in the climb, and from 10,000 feet in the descent until the plane is locked in at the gate. That means I don't want to hear about the Seahawk game, I don't want to hear about what you did on vacation, and I don't want to hear about what your kids do in school. We're just going to focus on the matter at hand. On rare occasions when we go through our checklist, something doesn't match. In that instance, we'll stop the checklist, complete the entire procedure of configuring the controls and systems, and once that's done, we'll start the checklist from the beginning. Here's the first page of a 767 normal checklist. As you can see, it's simple and succinct. If I'm flying the first flight of the day, I have to do the functional items that are at the top, that are listed at the top of the checklist. For example, if the plane leaves Honolulu at 10 p.m. and arrives in Seattle at 6 a.m., the next flight is considered the first flight of the day. The remainder of the checklist is done for each and every flight. The majority of items of challenge and response occur during the pre-flight at the gate prior to pushback. As I mentioned earlier, critical items are duplicated. For example, the flaps on the taxi checklist and before takeoff checklist. I just got to mention our QRH, our Quick Reference Handbook. Our Quick Reference Handbook, we each have them off to the sides of both the captain and the first officer. The QRH is used to handle a non-normal incident. They are not considered checklists per se, but a guide to follow if needed. When I sit down in the cockpit, I check the proper configuration of controls and systems prior to engine start. This is commonly referred to as a pre-flight full pattern. A great deal of the flight logistics are done prior to pushback. There are many people involved in planning the flight. Just to name a few, we have dispatchers, meteorologists, load control planners, all based at our Atlanta Operational Control Center. But there's always small variations that we deal with. For example, taxi route changes or small changes in the routing that we receive from the local air traffic controllers. In this photo, I'm reviewing the clearance we received 30 minutes prior to pushback from the local airport. The standard procedure is for the pilot monitoring to read the clearance to the pilot flying, and we both verify the anticipated runway, the standard instrument departure, the initial altitude cleared, the final altitude expected, the transponder code, and the departure control frequency. The reason for the detailed review is that sometimes our actual clearance is occasionally different from our filed flight plan. Prior to every flight, we have a cockpit briefing, which is a general overview from the period from pushback to takeoff and departure. The acronym that we use is WARTS. The WARTS briefing includes local weather, abnormals, runway, taxi and terrain, standard instrument departure, and special pages. We also review what gate we are at, our anticipated taxi plan, anticipated departure runway, and what our general plan is in case we have to return to the airport or to an alternate airport. A WARTS briefing sounds simple, but at some airports, the hardest part of the job is taxiing around the airport. At this point, I've called for a pre-flight checklist, which the first officer will read, and I will respond. It's mandatory that controls and indicators are observed as being in their proper position. It's my personal habit to point, verify, and respond to the checklist challenge. The response to the checklist cannot just be a response. It needs to be observed and noted. In this photo, I'm just checking the pressurization panel. Our flight plan is loaded into our CDU, our Control Display Unit, also known as the box. Everybody calls it the box, prior to calling for a pre-flight checklist. What we do here is the pilot flying will upload all the data to the box, we'll pre-flight the box, and the pilot monitoring will pre-flight the overhead panel, the center mode control panel, and the center console. And then we'll reverse roles. The pilot monitoring will check all the data in the box, and pilot flying will do the overhead panel, the center console. And this sounds like duplication, but it's a check of each other's work. Just a note about our transponder. The transponder is located behind the throttles and gives the air traffic controllers all the essential information on our flight. Position, airspeed, altitude, rate of climb or descent, and our ground track. It also interrogates other aircraft transponders, which are used in our TCAS system, our Traffic Collision and Avoidance System. Another helpful feature of the transponder is that it is of great use for ground controllers who are managing multiple airplanes taxiing on the ground. In this photo, we are at the point of our checklist where we are reconfirming our assigned transponder code, what we refer to as our squawk. On occasion, a non-normal situation may present itself. Because of the automated cockpits, a warning that will display on our center panel called our ICAS, our Engine Indicating Computer Alert System, indicating default. In a non-normal, non-catastrophic situation, the captain determines who will be flying the plane. It could be the pilot flying, or it could be the pilot monitoring. The pilot monitoring will go to the quick reference handbook and find the correct procedure to remedy the situation. Abnormals can be separated into what we call a time bucket or a no time bucket in terms of resolution. Most abnormals fit into the you have time bucket. NASA researchers have studied the difficulties of designing checklists and procedures for emergency and abnormal situations. As you can imagine, there are challenges with having multiple checklists for every situation. These challenges include the phase of flight when the situation occurs, the multiple clues, the wording of the abnormal checklist, and the compressed time and distractions that could be occurring. In our training scenarios, we review different situations that could have led to bigger problems. We'll talk about an example of a catastrophic non-normal, a no-time situation with the landing on Hudson in a few moments. Before we move on, I wanted to share a brief overview of our Flight Operations QA program, or FOQA. It's been said it's one of the most effective initiatives in aviation in the last 20 years. FOQA uses up to 2,000 parameters of data from individual flights or aggregated data for multiple flights in order to look for trends that can affect safety. I'll give an example of this. Prior to landing, the aircraft is configured for what we call a stabilized approach. That means that at a certain altitude above the airport touchdown zone elevation, we must be fully configured with the landing gear down, the flaps extended, and at the proper approach speed. If any of these parameters not met, a FOQA alert is sent out from the plane to the FOQA analyzing group. I don't have any control over what data is sent out. The plane does it automatically. If the FOQA group sees a trend, we will be alerted by an all-pilot bulletin, or the scenario can be incorporated into our next training session. Before going to that landing on the Hudson, I just wanted to talk about crew resource management. Crew resource management, or CRM, came out of a workshop that was sponsored by NASA back in 1979. The researchers used lessons from previous accidents by reviewing the flight data and cockpit voice recorders from incidents, as well as crew interviews to understand the relationship between human error and aviation safety. CRM uses all available resources in order to achieve safe and efficient operations. It's been shown to reduce errors, avoid stress, and increase efficiency. My personal belief is that it's not a top-down relationship. It's where we all work together for a common goal. I am not always right. The key phrase I like to reflect on is assertiveness with respect. It basically comes down to following procedure and communicating respectfully. If you see something you don't like, speak up. Don't be shy, speak up. CRM covers 3 essential areas in the cockpit: cognitive and interpersonal skills, as well as communication style. Just being aware of the importance of teamwork helps with problem solving and situational awareness. It's the only way to create a productive working environment of trust and support where crew members are confident they can pass on information to each other in order to solve problems. Our shared purpose on every flight is safety. We have a saying, it's not my flight leg, it's not your flight leg, it's our flight leg. If we ding an airplane, then everybody loses. In aviation, we have a culture of mandatory training to enhance safety. Every 9 months, I go to Atlanta for 2 days of simulator training, covering both routine and non-normal situations, including crew resource management. Oftentimes, the simulator scenario incorporates data captured from an actual flight where the crew encountered a challenge. The challenge may have led to a change in our procedures, and I'm being given the opportunity to practice in a non-threatening environment. Every 2 years, a line check captain rides in the cockpit to evaluate us during a scheduled flight, and once in a while, an FAA check pilot will observe our performance. The best example of the proper use of CRM and checklists is the landing of the Hudson. About 2 minutes into the flight, at just under 3,000 feet, U.S. Air Flight 1549 hit a large flock of birds, which went through both engines, resulting in a catastrophic event, complete loss of thrust in both engines. This situation fits into the no time bucket. The crew had to work fast to solve the problem. The immediate issues, including identifying the engine diagnostics, notifying air traffic control, and pulling the correct non-normal checklist. The environmental issues were mixed. They were in a major metropolitan area, but it was daylight and the weather was calm. According to the NTSB report, the crew had only 75 seconds from the time the captain told the air traffic controller that he couldn't make it to Teterboro Airport until the actual touchdown in the river. The checklist in this instance was problematic. It was only written for high-altitude engine failure, where you'd have more time to remedy the situation. The crew was only able to get through half the checklist. Fortunately, because of Captain Sully's experience, he started the APU, the Auxiliary Power Unit, early in the incident, even before getting to it on the checklist. This ensured electrical power was supplied for the flight instruments. Because of this incident, the NTSB made the recommendation that low-level dual engine failure checklist be developed. In the NTSB investigation, they cited factors that contributed to everyone surviving the accident. Decision-making and their CRM during the accident sequence was called out. In addition, the proximity of emergency responders was critical given the water temperature of the Hudson in January. This is not me, but I can relate to this guy. Crew fatigue has long been a serious issue in aviation. The NTSB has been making recommendations to the FAA regarding pilot fatigue since 1972. I'll throw some numbers at you here. And 20% of 182 major investigations over an 11-year period by the NTSB, fatigue was identified as a probable cause, contributing factor, or finding. The 2016 annual NTSB report to Congress listed crew fatigue as their #1 issue to be addressed. According to sleep experts, we know the average person requires approximately 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep, which I don't get, for optimal performance, health, and safety. Fatigue causes many issues, including impaired decision-making, slowed reaction times, and loss of situational awareness, all critical to safe operation of aircraft. There are many challenges that contribute to fatigue. There's the occasional unexpected delay, and I'll just talk a little bit about commuting here. Not all pilots commute, but many do. We can live anywhere we want. It's my responsibility to get to my assigned home base in time for check-in. Fortunately, for the past 13 years, I've been based here in Seattle, which is in the same time zone as my home in San Diego. And that hasn't always been the case. I've commuted as far as San Diego to Detroit just to get to work. My normal work or flight schedule can change monthly depending on what I bid. And then there's multiple time zones that I encounter. But what works for me is the term west is best. If I fly west to Asia, I can acclimate quickly. Flying east is okay, but I have a much harder time acclimating once I get home. The Colgan Air Flight 3407 accident in 2009 really changed everything in terms of aviation rest rules. The accident happened because of a loss of control during an instrument approach to Buffalo, New York. In the NTSB report, the accident was blamed on pilot error. When reading the report, the captain's failure to follow standard operating procedure and the first officer's failure to challenge the captain's deviations was not consistent with CRM's noted. It also states that the pilot's performance was likely impaired by fatigue, but the extent of that impairment and degree to which it contributed to performance deficiencies could not conclusively be determined. What we do know is that both pilots had long commutes and had not slept in a bed before departing. The captain had a sleep depth of about 6 to 12 hours and was landing at his normal bedtime. First officer had commuted in overnight from Seattle and had only 8.5 hours of sleep in a couch in the flight operations crew room in the previous 34 hours. As a result of this accident, the FAA established a comprehensive approach to combating fatigue in commercial aviation. In January of 2000, the government imposed FAR, Federal Air Regulation 117, pilot duty and rest rules based scientifically on sleep deprivation studies. We have stricter limits on how many hours we can work, how many hours we have off, and the minimum layover rest requirements. I have to sign a paper certifying that I am fit for duty prior to every flight, including multiple flights in a single day. If I'm fatigued, the airline has to replace me. I can voluntarily extend by 2 hours my scheduled duty flight period because of delays. I can't be penalized if I decline to extend the hours. It's important to note that these rules are never violated. Just a comment about the trip analyzer that evaluates our schedules. As I mentioned earlier, my work schedule changes on a monthly basis. An average schedules around 80 hours of flight time per month, a little lower in the winter, a little higher in the summertime. The trips are printed out every month, and we bid for them in seniority order between the 4th and 11th of every month. It's gone from paper bidding with a 5-minute window to call in our request to computer bidding, which is much more efficient. The FAR rules are built into the current schedules. If I want to change my schedule, I'll put in a request, but it has to go through the trip analyzer to make sure the request complies with the rules. Commuting is not factored into the trip analyzer, but overtime flying is. If I volunteer to fly overtime, the request is routed through the trip analyzer prior to me being awarded the trip. And again, the rules are never violated, even if I feel that I've had sufficient rest. I just talk about some of the emerging issues we face. Aviation safety has ongoing threats that are always being addressed. In addition to terrorist threats, some of the recent issues are explosives on laptops, drones, laser strikes at the cockpit, and lithium-ion batteries, which are unique in their ability to start and maintain a fire. I'm just going to talk about a pilot shortage, and to some parents in the audience here who might have high school or college-age kids who are undecided about future careers, you might want to suggest looking at aviation. Since January 1st of 2014, Delta Airlines has hired about 4,000 pilots, so almost 1,000 pilots a year. We have over 14,000 working for the airline at this time, and many thousands more are due to retire, including myself, over the next 10 years because of the mandatory retirement age of 65. We have a large block of pilots within a smaller age group of age 55 to 65. It's been an exciting career, and I'd like to think I have balance in my life given my work schedules. Even though I've been away from home almost half of every month, I've been able to have blocks of uninterrupted family time, made a pretty good income, and traveled the world. The one word I would like to use to young people starting out in the profession is perseverance. But with the current ongoing shortage, pilots can progress in their careers much more quickly. My suggestion to you is if you want to introduce some of your kids to aviation, go down to the local airport and buy them a couple flying lessons. And again, thanks for the opportunity to speak this morning. While our professions are quite different, I think we share a similar responsibility of keeping our passengers and patients safe. I welcome any questions.